Hello everybody and welcome back to our Unreal Engine 4 and Playfab series. This episode we're going to be looking at player data and title data. So let's begin with title data. Titles data can be set within content from Playfab. There are two different types of title data. You have the regular title data, which is data that's accessible to all players to be able to read, and then title internal data. Now this is only available for servers of your game, so most of the time you'll probably want to use just title data. Title data is a good way of setting values that would be read by every client of the game that would be the same without every single game. So say for example if you had a card game, you could set the maximum amount of time per turn. All the client would have to do is read from here what you've set and then hook it up into the game. And as long as it reads it correctly, then it should always be the same no matter what. It also allows you to dynamically change values that would affect your game, such as turn time. So you could change it from say 2 minutes to a minute and a half, and it would instantly update in here, and as soon as any new game would start that would read the data from here, it would then update it in real time. Player data, on the other hand, is data that would be set the same key value for every player, however would have a completely different value. So what that means is that you could have something like a number of wins as a player data, and it would update differently for every user depending on how many wins they actually have. There are three different types of player data. You've got the normal player data, the read-only data, and internal data. Again, internal data is probably best saved for servers only. Read-only data is data that the client can only read, it can never set. And player data, the client can get and set this value. So let's start with some examples. I think the first one we're going to do is title data because it's the easiest to set up. So we'll go to new title data, and then from in here we'll add in a key. For example, we're going to put turn timer, and then you want to keep the value if it's something like seconds and minutes, you want to keep it constant throughout the game. So if you want to use seconds, you'd put 120, and if you want to use minutes, you put 2. However, you probably want to keep it in the same no matter what, so that it's always easier to convert it in game. And then all you do is simply say save. Now you can see here we have turn timer. So our title data has successfully been put in. We'll go into overrides in probably an advanced tutorial of the title data, as this will also come into effect during experiments. All we'd have to do now in order to read this turn timer data is simply either write a cloud script or call get title data from within the engine, hook up the parameter name, which is turn timer, and then receive the data. I'll show you how to do that shortly. The same method is also used to set title internal data, but again, this will most likely be useful for server-only data. For now, I think we're going to set up the call within Cloud Script to read the title data. So I'm just going to jump across to my Cloud Script. It's probably best when doing these sort of things to have two tabs, one for your data and one specifically for your Cloud Script. So then, the same as last time, we're just going to simply need to create a function to call from within the engine. So let's do handlers.test title data equals function args and context. And there we go, basic function created. So then, let's start by creating the variable that will pass through. If you're going to use this Cloud script in order to get the title data, you're going to need to pass through the title data that you actually want to receive. So it's probably best to do the same that we did as before and put var data equals args dot title name. As long as we pass through title name when we call the Cloud script, it will successfully gather which title data we need. When passing through title data, it should probably be set to as a string so it's easier to update. Then all we need to do is make the call. So we're going to do var value equals server dot get title data, and then simply put in the brackets needed. Then inside of get title data, you need to put in keys. Now this will be an array of keys that will correlate to your title data. You can simply add them in either as strings, like so. Now remember, this is an array, so you can put in multiple. So you could do something like this and it would gather both of them. Or you could put in the data that we're passing through, due to the fact that we're passing through a string of the title name anyway. This will then return the value of the title data of your title name. Now, it will come through as a whole JSON value. It won't just return the value, it will return the whole key JSON. So we'll probably want to put in a log.info and then put in value. This will show you exactly what I mean. Then afterwards, we need to make sure that we split it down to show the exact value of the result. In order to do this, we can simply just do a log.info, and then inside of here, we just need to put value.data, and then the bracket, and then inside of here, we need to put data. So what this is going to do is log the value like we do here, but it's going to specifically get the data part of it, and it's going to use the string of the title name that we're passing through. This should hopefully then just simply return our value of our title data, which was 120. So all we need to do now is run this script. So of course, like always, you're just going to want to save and deploy the version. Now, when testing the scripts through Cloud Script of a player, you don't specifically need to always publish it, because you'll be able to select the exact version that you're going to run anyway, such as in here. See, we can select any of them, it just defaults to a live one. So when testing stuff, it's probably just better to set it to live. So then we're just going to find our call, test title data, and put in the arguments needed. Now we're passing through a title data called title name, so make sure that's the same, and then enter the value of turn timer, making sure to put in the capitalization and the spaces, because again it can be pretty tricky. Make sure it conforms to the JSON, and then simply run the Cloud Script. You can see here that it's finding the correct JSON full data value of turn timer and 120, and then in the second log that we print, it literally just prints the value that we need. So let's jump across to our project and get this set up. Again, we're inside the Playfab graph of our game instance. So let's create a custom event and call that get title data. Now here you probably want to add a key name and just set it to key name. This will simply mean that we can just pass through the input when we use it. If you're going to use this for multiple calls, it could make problems. So if you're going to do it through the engine of getting the get title data API, you probably want to make different calls for each one rather than use the same. I'll explain in a minute why that could be a problem. So now we just simply need to do the calls. Again, as update statistic, we need to string field because we're passing through our key name. So again, hook up key name to field name, and in here you put your title data value. Ours was turn timer. From here, you want to drag out and get title data. Now you want to make sure that it doesn't call the admin one, but it calls the client one. Admin is specifically for servers only, and even then it's specifically for users with admin access. So then now all we need to do is make our request and then simply hook up the keys value here. Then we have to hook up the success and failed nodes as normal. So success get title data and failed get title data. Now we can just simply hook up our failed function that we created before, which will deal with any errors that happen. Then off of the results, we simply need to break, get data, get string field, and hook up our key name, like so. Now this is where the errors will happen that I was talking about. If you make multiple calls to the get title data, if you just use a single event like this, because of the time it takes from the server of Playfab to receive the call and then send back the success, you could have called another get title data, in which case his key name will have changed. So the data that is being returned in the result will actually be different and will not contain the field name that you're looking for. The two ways around this are to create events for every different type of call that you want to make, so that only this call contains this data, or do it inside of Cloud Script because it's a lot easier to manage because it's run directly through Playfab. So it will only ever contain the key that you pass through and then return with the key and the corrected value data. However, if we just do the single call and then do a print string, this will return our value, which was 120. Seeing as we set this up as a Cloud Script function, now you can do exactly the same as we did here with update statistics. So you could simply just create the execute Cloud Script event, set the string field, and then get the results. So we'll just do that now. And then this should get our call. So test title data. And generate the play stream event from it. Again, set it to live and ignore the rest. And then hook up the success. So let's put a custom event, success, get title data script. And then the same for failed. Now you can call these whatever you want, it doesn't really matter, but it's handy in case of errors. So get title data script. Again, hook up the failed event that we have, due to this will handle all of the errors. And again, off of cloud script, break the results. And then here, you would see the logs and the function result, function results. So off of function results, you want to drag out and do get field. Then when we do this inside the cloud script, we'll set a field name. So here we'll just put value for now. Then as string, because it will be returned as a string. You can also do this as different things. So if you know for a fact that it's going to be returned as a bool, if you set it up in cloud script, or a number or an array, then you can do this. But most of the time it's probably best to just use string. And then we can simply just hook this up and print, and this should print exactly the same as this event. Now, this is a lot easier to do inside of cloud script because you have a lot more control over what you're returning. So let's jump across back to our cloud script. And then in the event that we just created, you can quite easily do return. And then inside of here, you can actually set the key name of the message that you're returning with the value that you're returning. So we're going to return the value of this here that we logged, which would be exactly 120. Of course, you don't need to put the brackets in because it's not contained within the log info. And then inside of the key name, we called it an engine value. It's probably better to do it this way around and then call it an engine rather than call it an engine and then add it to the script. So if we were to call the script again now, it would still print the two logs. However, under the results, it would also have here function results. Instead of null, it would say pretty much the exact same thing as this, apart from it's returning it rather than a log. So then let's just save this again to make sure that any changes that are done are received both in engine and on the client. There we go. So if we were to run this now and use the exact same title name and turn timer inside of here, of course refresh because it doesn't update the revisions constantly. Need to set the function name again to test title data and run the cloud script. Oh, just got to remove that there. There we go. You can see here function result, it's returning a value and 120. Now this would be exactly the same in the engine. So the event that we made just a moment ago, it would get the field value and it would return its result basically as a string of 120. Now you can have more control over this because you can return multiple things inside of the event from cloud script rather than the specific one that you're doing in here. So you could add on a multiple load of things. You could do value. You could put on, I don't know, the name of the title that you're getting. You could put anything in here and it would all just come off this one cloud script, meaning that you could get quite a few calls of data in just one cloud script event rather than having to do multiple versions of get title data so that the overlap doesn't happen between the field names. Now, Playfab does have a limit on this. You can only make 5 API execution calls, I believe, within one function per one call. So you can't go crazy and have everything run off one execute cloud script. It just wouldn't work. Playfab would stop you from doing this. But if something required quite a few data values to get returned at the exact same time, you could just put it into a cloud script and have it return all of them at the exact same time because they would run off the one success event call. Then just simply get the field and return the value. And then inside of your cloud script, you would simply just add on more data. So then you'd put something like name. And then here you'd put whatever you want it to be, ABC. And then inside of the engine, it would return this as well. Of course, we don't need this, so I'm just going to get rid of it before it breaks something. So we've successfully set up the title data that we're going to talk about today, and in engine and via CloudScript. Now this will update anytime you make that call. However, you cannot set, or should not set rather, the title data from within the client. It could go pretty crazy. Title data should be mainly for read-only data that the admins, i.e. us, are to change, and it's things that are going to remain constant throughout any gameplay. Now, if you want to set data, it's probably better to use that for player data, so things like wins, losses, draws, cards played, heroes played, for example, if you're making a card game. There's other things that you could do in shooters, so you could keep track of how many bullets they've fired, how many people they've killed, all this sort of stuff, and this would all go inside player data. So let's have a look at that. Now, player data isn't set up the same way as title data. Title data, you can simply just do it once inside of the main Playfab website, and it will update automatically, and everyone will have access to this as long as you do the calls that we've done before. If you were to specifically just go to a player and put in player data title and just put in something here, it would only exist for that one player. Now, for testing purposes, this can be quite useful because you can quickly put in a player data and be able to use it instantly for you to test or your team to test. If you want something for every player, though, to be able to update, you need to set it up initially. Now, the best way to do this is just to use CloudScript. Doing it inside of Engine can cause a lot of problems, whereas CloudScript, it's just a lot easier and we have more control over it. So we're just going to set up a very basic set player data value and then make sure that it updates correctly. So let's jump across back to our CloudScript and create this function. So we're going to start off by creating a new function, handlers.testPlayerData equals function, arguments and context. There we go. And then inside of here, we're probably going to want to get the title data again. So we're going to do var data equals args.titleName. Then we're going to want to create the function in order to get the user data. So this is how you do it. You'd create a variable called player data equals server.getUserData. You can see here the internal data. This is a separate call, but obviously we're going to use just the standard getUserData for this. And then inside of the parameters, we have two. We've got Playfab ID. And again, this is just simply the standard ID of the player that's calling the CloudScript. Now, most of the time, you're going to use current player ID. This just defaults to the ID of the player that's calling it, so the server automatically knows who's doing it. Again, you can pass through others, but for the meantime, we're just going to use that. And the second one is keys. Now, keys is actually an array of keys rather than just one single one, which means that if you had a function that was going to require getting several pieces of the user data, instead of using each individual call, like say if we had two of these, this would actually do the call twice on the Playfab API and would use up your count towards your 5 API calls maximum per function, and it would also increase the amount of time the function would run. Now, there is a limit of 1 second on the API call. Now, you might think, oh, 1 second's quite small. It's quite big in terms of the amount of that can happen during that time. But instead of that, we're just going to put everything into one function. This way, it keeps things cleaner and it reduces the API call time. So there are two ways of putting this in. You can either enter the string manually. Now, this would return the exact key and is useful if you have a function that you know is going to only return the one type of key and it's never ever going to change. Then that is quite useful. If you want something just as simple as get data and you pass through the data title name, like we're doing here, then it's quite useful to not put it as that and actually save it as a variable and call it into there. Now, obviously, you can then just add on more of them, and it will just return them. So, now that we have that, seeing as this is a get data function, we're probably going to want to check that the data is actually there and valid. So we're going to want to create an if function, and inside of here we're going to do player data and player data dot data and player data dot data, and inside data. Now, poor birds on my behalf on the terms of variable names, but in essence, this is checking to see that the variable we have set here has actually been set correctly. So that's one check. It's also checking to see that it actually contains data within it, so it's not null and actually exists. And then this is actually checking to see that the data is actually containing the key name that we need and its value. So if you have this and it actually runs through fine, then that will mean that this actually exists, the key name has been put in correctly or passed through correctly, and it actually has a value assigned to it. Now, in our last episode, we looked at setting up a rule for default values, which is this here. So we already know that it will have a default value attached to it. So this is just making a double check. Otherwise, you just put an else here, but that's probably not the way to go. In the last episode, when we looked at this, this is definitely the way to go with setting up default values. So inside of here, we'll just put a simple log.info in order to tell us that we're receiving the data. So we can put something like data, player data is, and then simply put plus, then player data dot data brackets data, and then because it's a player data value and not a title one, we need to put dot value at the end of this. This actually returns the value of the JSON key, rather than if we take this away, it would just simply return the key name and the value. So, seeing as we've logged it, and because this is a get function that we're probably going to call fruit engine, we're most likely going to want to return it. So we're going to want to add on a return, and then inside of the return function, we're going to want to simply put value, colon, then player data dot data brackets data dot value. So the same as we have here. Now this will mean that in engine we'll be able to just search for the value, the string field called value anyway, and it should return the exact value that we need. So then, if we now save and deploy this version, we can give it a quick test. Now, our specific player that you created when you first made and launched Playfab from our first episode in the series was around before we created the condition in the second episode to do with default values, which means that this never ran for the player. So you might, when you go to player data, you might actually see that there's nothing already in here. So we're probably going to want to make sure that we actually have this wins and 0. So just quickly pop this in. You'll only ever have to do this for this player or your player whenever testing newer values before you publish them to other people. Because we created this for the first instance before we even set up the rule, it never happened. Your player never called the game added title because it existed beforehand. So this never got set up initially. Now, once you have the rule, if you were to create a new character, or if you were to delete this whole entity and remake one by launching the game for the first time again, then you would have this. But the quickest way just to test stuff is to simply just add it in dead fast and then make sure that you save. So now, if we go to the cloud script, make sure that we have our latest version, go to the function that we just made, test player data, and then make sure that we have title name and then the name that we're going to find. So title name colon wins. And then just make sure that it conforms to JSON, which it does, yep. And then if we run this cloud script, you can see that it's successful. And player data is, I forgot to add the space, but it doesn't matter, 0. So it is successfully finding the player data for wins, which means that this is now successful and ready to go. So I'm just going to show you how to hook up these in Engine, and then hopefully we should be done. So then let's begin with the first one. First off, we're going to do the get user data from within the API call of the engine. So we're going to do a custom event and call it get user data 1, just so that we know the difference between the two. Then get user data, and then make sure it's the client version, and make the request. Now inside the request, the only thing that we need to worry about here is the keys. If you wanted to make a call for another Playfab user, i.e. not yourself or not the player that's going to be calling it through the game, then you'd hook up the Playfab ID here. This is the same as it is in CloudScript, however here you need to hook up the ID straight into here. So because we're going to be making this call in Engine, we're going to want an input, and we're going to call that key. And then we're just going to simply hook that up. So in our example, that'll be title name. So off of here, again, need to hook up the custom event. So we'll call that get user data 1 success. And then on the failed, we'll do exactly the same as before, get user data failed. Make sure to put the 1 in so we don't forget which one is which. And then we're just going to hook up our failed function. So on the success, you can see now why it is easier to use CloudScript to return the actual value that you need. This returns data, so a JSON object. So there's a lot of things that you can do with this, but in order to get the data, you need to get field, and then most of the time you'll probably see people do this and then get the first one, because this will always be data, and the name can sometimes change, so you can just hook it up like this. The best thing to do as well is that if this is something new that you're doing and you're unsure of the field names, you could just simply create a for each loop and then print off the names like so. At least then you can have a look at what you're getting back from Playfab, and you can have a look at the keys that you can hook up. Now, with things like player data, you'll probably do this within CloudScript anyway, but there are some things that you'll do inside of Engine, so things like the inventory of the player, you'll probably want to return that. Like, you'll probably do the call for that in Engine, and you'll probably, like, everyone has this get field names when you return, and it returns data. So the best way to figure out what you're actually getting is to simply do this, and then you can make calls by getting get field to see what it returns. But for now, we're just going to simply ignore that and hook up the first one. Then you'll need to do as object, because this is actually as the JSON object. The original one that it returns here is basically like an object within an object, so it returns everything all together, like the request, and then you're simply getting here the data and returning it as a JSON object. Then you're going to want to simply get field names again. Now, this is the JSON object that we returned. So in our function we had return. This sort of has a similar thing going for it. So if you have multiple keys, or you're making this call because it's just simple get user data and it can be used many times, you could iterate through which data you want to actually look at. If you know that there's only one that you're going to look at, you can just get the same and then get string field. Like so. This is our data value that we returned. So this will be 0 or whatever wins is equal to. Now, as you can see, this is pretty much a gigantic pain in the butt to do in Engine. Not because there's anything wrong with the API that Playfab have created for the Unreal Engine, but just simply because getting user data returns the JSON object of the whole result that you then have to split down into the result that you specifically want. Then you have to then split that down again to separate the results that were returned. And this can be a giant pain in the butt just to get a simple value. Now, there are probably a couple of times where this could be useful, but off the top of my head, I can't think of many. If you're just using get user data to return a specific string or bool or number, then it's probably better to simply do it inside of CloudScript. So we're now just going to do the CloudScript one, which is exactly the same as how we did for get title data script. And then you can see already just by looking at the title one how much shorter this is. the script just simply returns the value, and then we can just hook it up into whatever we need, rather than having to do this just to get the value in engine. But of course, instead of like with the straight get user data of passing through the key, we're passing through the key name that we've set up to pass through the cloud script. Then this will simply find the wins and return it. All we also need to do is just change the function name that we're calling, because obviously we're not calling the same function. So the function we're going to be calling is the test player data. So all we need to do is hook that up, and then the rest of it should be ready to go. So now, if we were to run the cloud script one, we would simply just get back 0. Same with the get user data, we would also get 0, but you can see how much more power you have through cloud script. You would have to go through each individual one of these, and if the get user data wasn't something as simple as a string, if it was an array of strings, or if it was a JSON object, because you can save JSON objects in there, then it could become quite complex, and you'd have to here, instead of get field name in order to get the first one, which is basically just the value that we're of wins, you could end up having to filter through quite a few separate things. Whereas with the cloud script, all you need to do is set up the return, similar to how we did inside of the cloud script. So instead of just setting value and then what it is, you could put anything in here. You could set up multiple, you could set up arrays, you could set up JSON objects, you could set up anything, and then simply inside of the engine just call get the return of whatever you called it, and then it would simply just put out the data, which, as you can tell, is probably a lot better. Plus, it is a lot safer because it's already run inside of CloudScript. And as we discussed in the last episode, CloudScript is a lot better for making sure that everything is run correctly and there's no hacking happening because it's run on the server side. So then let's create the new set function for our player data. So again, it's the normal handlers dot then the function name test set player data equals function args and context. There we go. Now, with setting data, you probably don't want to pass through something like a title name, because setting the data could be anything. You don't want to have a load of conditions here with variables, with names that you're going to pass through, or objects that you're going to pass through, just in case you pass through that right one. So if you're going to call set player data from within the cloud script, I would recommend having one for each data that you're going to call. It just makes it a lot simpler, and then also as well you have a bit more control over it, whereas if you do it just a generic one, it can get pretty messy pretty quick. So instead of doing the title name stuff that we did at the start of getting the title data or the player data, all we're going to do is simply just get server dot update user data, and then in here there's only two parameters to fill in. I always forget the first one because it's always the same, which is the Playfab ID, and then the second one is our data. Now again, this is in the form of a JSON, so it'll have the key name, colon, and then the parameter that you're setting. So say if we wanted to update the value which we've been using currently of wins, so we just put wins in here, and then you could set this, if you want to set it directly to something, which is probably useful for if you're setting, I don't know, a specific time of something, which obviously you'd use the functions to get the current time, but you'd set the actual time. If you want to have the value and increase what it currently is, then I'll show you just in a moment how to do that. Basically, you just need to get the data, turn it into a value, and then increment it by whatever you want to increment it by. So say if we're just going to set wins to, I don't know, 2, then that would be that. Obviously, I'd probably recommend enclosing it inside the string because, again, the JSON format prefers strings. Then, if we want to do something a little bit more specific by incrementing the data, obviously if it's just going to be something that increments by the same value every single time, say number of wins or losses. I know obviously we've been using wins as an example in our player data, but that is just an example. But sometimes it might be better to use a statistic which we'll go into in the next episode of the series. And the statistic, it just allows you to increase it by the same each time, or it's kind of like you can turn them into leaderboards, and it's very easy for specifically number data. So if you're going to use number data, it's probably a lot easier to use statistics. Now, obviously, we'll get more into that next time, but for this time, we're going to pretend that we're doing it inside of the player data. So if you want to do this, and obviously, first off, you're going to need to get the data that you need, basically. So you need to do var player data equals server.getUserData. Then obviously call the normal Playfab ID with current player ID and the keys for the data. Again, we're currently using wins. So that will return the player data. Then if you're going to do this, the best thing to do is probably try and put it inside of a try and catch method, which CloudScript supports, which will help you catch any errors, basically, that happen. It's a bit different to when it happens inside of the Unreal Engine, because you have an unfailed event called whenever you try this sort of stuff, and it prints out the errors. In CloudScript, sometimes this can still work perfectly fine, even if it doesn't actually do what you wanted to. It's more about like if it actually functions rather than did it do what you actually wanted it to do. So we're going to put it inside of a try method, and then inside of here we're going to do if statement and do player data and player data dot data and player data dot data, and then inside of here wins. Again, this is just to specifically make sure that the data that we're getting is actually valid rather than being null or being empty. And then inside of here we just want to create a variable and call it value equals player data dot data wins. This will basically just set it as the actual data. Now you can put an else in here if you want it to set to an empty string, but for now we're just going to ignore that. And then here we're going to create a new variable called new value equals JSON.parse, put in the value that was set just above, and then add 1. So what this should hopefully do is pass the JSON value. You can read a little bit more about what this actually does inside of the Playfab documentation. But in other words, you can stringify a JSON with JSON.stringify, and the parse basically turns it back into the value that it should be. So if it's a number, then it should turn it back into a number specifically just inside of here, just so we can do things like add 1 to it. Okay, once you've got that, we're probably going to want to do a log and put something like new value is. However, because we're turning this inside of a log, and this new value is no longer a stringified JSON, we're going to quickly just call JSON.stringify and then put the new value inside of there. This is needed once you do the parse. It must be turned back to the stringify value basically in order to do things like log it as a dlog, and also it should really be needed to set back into the data. However, of course, it depends. If you've always used it as a number, then don't suddenly start randomly changing it back to a string. Try and keep it as what it was, which is why I mentioned that it's always better to make individual functions for the setting methods. So in order to set, we just need to simply use this again, the server update user data. Although it has horribly aligned that. And then instead of putting here in the wins, comma 2, we'd simply put in the new value. So because we didn't stringify the new value, all I've done here is set up an extra little return value and simply JSON stringified it and then passed through that value. This is just to make sure that the JSON actually gets set correctly rather than using the specific values that we changed with the JSON.parse. Forgot to do it last time, but with a try method you always need to add a catch to it in order to catch the exceptions that might happen. So in here, all we need to simply do is add catch as a little function with E inside of it. Then simply do a log.debug exception. Then you could either put it on the end here, like this, or make a new one. It doesn't really matter. And then I've just noticed as well that on this, where we're setting it to var value, we need to put value at the end of it because it's the player data, not the title data. The player data requires you to have the value at the end. So now if we just simply deploy this and then go back to our client, to our player, refresh to make sure we get the latest version, test set player data, and run this, you can see here that it's successfully done it and it's printed new value is, and then 3. So if we quickly pop across again, there we go, you can see that it's been set to 3. Now this is useful for if you have, say, different game modes and you want to keep track inside of the player value of how many game modes of each type they've played. You could do these as individual statistics, however, having them all inside of one key value, say game mode, which is stored within the player, you can then just simply look at multiple datas without having to open up different statistics. Plus as well with statistics, it automatically creates leaderboards for them. Again, we'll go into it next time, but it can get quite messy if you just want to simply store little bits of data. Now you can do this in Engine as you can with most things. However, I would always recommend probably doing it through CloudScript, so I'm not going to show you how to set it up. It's a little bit of a pain in order to set it up in an engine because it requires you passing through data that isn't really needed, because most of the time if you do it through CloudScript like we've shown, you don't need to pass anything through. The CloudScript will automatically figure out everything you need to worry about and then update it from there. So I'm not going to show you, but if you want to go into your own time, you can just play around with it in the engine. The calls are already all there. It's just update user data as it is in here, and it should just simply be a tiny little bit of setting the player data in the JSON object, similar to how we've done with other things. So in today's episode, we've looked at title data and player data and how to get them from the game, and then we've also looked at setting player data from within CloudScript. The title data and player data getting we've done both in CloudScript and within the engine, but we've only set up the CloudScript for setting player data. In the next episode, we're going to be looking at statistics and leaderboards and their integration again with Unreal and Playfab. So I hope to see you then. Bye!